Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be the third and final installment for this year's season of Coatmas. If you're new to my channel or missed the last two videos in Coatmas, they will be linked down below. If you have no idea what Coatmas is, it's basically my play on Vlogmas, but instead of vlogging every day up until Christmas, I make a whole bunch of coats and share the process of that with all of you. So far, I have followed an Excel pattern from the 1920s and a simplicity pattern from the 1930s. And today we're moving on another decade, right on into the late 1940s or even the early 50s. I'm not sure the exact date of this pattern, and they weren't printing them on the patterns at this point in time. Regardless of what decade it's from, it is an absolutely beautiful coat pattern by Advance. It is a swing coat pattern, so it's very full, and it also has a detachable hood. Now, hoods aren't something that I get to make nearly often enough, and it's what drew me to this pattern in the first place. And apparently it drew a lot of other people to this pattern as well, because it was by far the winner of a poll I posted on Patreon for what coat I should make from this particular decade, because I had quite a few patterns to choose from. But I was pretty pleased to see that this was the winner because it is such a stylish, lovely coat, and I really do love the detachable hood feature. So I was very excited to make it for Coatmas and to just make it in general, and that's what this video is all about. But the really exciting thing about this video, or what I hope will make it exciting, is the fact that I am attempting to make this coat in 24 hours. Now, I'd planned on all of the coats for Coatmas being fully constructed and all of the videos about them being fully edited before December, but life happened and that didn't end up happening. And as we creep closer and closer to Christmas, the less time I had to finish all of the coats that I had planned for Coatmas. So I decided to turn this into a challenge and to see if I could complete this coat in 24 hours. So stay tuned to see if that ended up happening and to see the process of putting it all together. So this is the pattern in question, which I'm sure I showed in the intro, and I've already gotten it cut out of the wool, and I made a few alterations to the length and the width of the pieces to better suit my size, since once again this pattern is a size 16 for a 34-inch bust. And vintage sizing is weird. Basically children's sizes went from 0 to 10, so women's sizes started at size 12. So a size 12 vintage pattern is more in line with a size 2, and a size 16 is more in line with a size 6. I'm going to be making view 2 of this pattern, the version with the collar and the hood and the tie, and I'm very excited about it. I've just gone ahead and read this side of the pattern, which I don't usually pay too much attention to. So these are the cutting instructions, and then on the other side you have the assembly instructions. And cutting is usually pretty intuitive to me, and I tend to do it based off of the width of my fabric rather than the instructions themselves. But in this case, there are specific instructions for cutting the facings and the lining, so I want to read those. So it says, for lining, use pieces A, B, C, and E. Cut off front B at the inner line of medium perforations and cut 1.5 inches off the lower edges of back A and front B. Cut off the lower edge of sleeve E on the line of medium perforations and cut 4 of the pocket. Now, I was originally going to line this using this black crepe because I thought that would be quite stylish, but I was a little disappointed in the weight of my recent 1930s swing coat and how not warm it was, even though I was using relatively heavy wool, because it didn't have any sort of inner lining. So then I was thinking about flatlining the pieces with flannel and then having a silky lining, but this flannel actually feels really lovely, and I kind of like the idea of having this against my skin instead of the cold silky lining. So I think I'm going to line the sleeves with a silky lining and then use the flannel for the rest of the lining, and I'm also going to be cutting the hood pattern for this black crepe because unfortunately I don't have enough of this wool to cut the hood pattern out twice, and you will see a little bit of the interior of the hood when the coat's worn, so I want to use a better coordinating fabric than this bright green flannel or this matching but not particularly pretty silky lining. It's currently almost 12:30, so that's going to be my goalpost, that hopefully I can finish this coat in either 24 or 48 hours. Okay, so you should have just seen a clip where I went ahead and I flatlined the hood and the sleeve pieces with flannel. And I did this because these pieces are going to have different lining fabrics, but I wanted them to have the same weight as the body of the coat. So I decided to flatline them with flannel prior to assembling them. So these are the hood pieces in front of me now. And after I finished basting the layers together, I went ahead and transferred the perforations on the tissue onto the fabric. Like the 1930s coat pattern I followed earlier in the week, this is a perforated pattern. So this was the most common type of pattern from the early 1900s, or pretty much as early as patterns came to exist, all the way into the 1940s and even 50s. This pattern is by Advance, and I don't think they started printing their tissue until the 1960s even. So this is an old but very common thing that you will see on tissue patterns, that instead of having various information marked using markings, instead they're indicated with perforations. Like these perforations here indicate where the dart is, these perforations here mark where the buttonhole is, these larger perforations are the grain line. So after my layers were basted together, I went ahead and transferred transfer the buttonholes and the dart placement onto the back side of the fabric. Now I'm actually going to sew the buttonholes first. I'd also like to sew the buttonholes into the front of the coat. If you're thinking that sounds a little bit backwards, let me take a few steps back, I guess. So I did go through and try and read through all of the instructions before I got started because a few people were upset that I didn't do that for the 1930s coat. But I'm a very visual person and I find instructions sort of difficult to comprehend unless I have the corresponding pieces in front of me and in a three-dimensional form that I can handle to try and figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. So I didn't find reading through these to be particularly helpful, though it definitely didn't hurt either. I feel like their order of assembly is a little bit odd. They want you to sew up the back seam and sew up the shoulder seams and insert the pockets, and then after you do that, they want you to sew on the collar and then bind the buttonholes. But it will be way easier to bind the buttonholes when the front panel is completely flat, so I feel like I want to do that first. And then when you go to the very end, there are the instructions for putting together the hood, but I sort of feel like doing the hood first, and then I can do the buttonholes for the hood at the same time as the buttonholes for the front of the jacket, and then I can go back to the start and sew up the back seam and the shoulder seams and whatnot. I also feel like I might assemble the collar and the sleeves before I assemble the main portion of the jacket, just because I feel like those are going to be more difficult, and I'd love to get them out of the way so I don't have to worry about them later on. That's why I'm working on the hood now, and the next step for the hood is sewing the buttonholes, as I said, and then sewing up the dart. I have also cut out the lining for the hood, and the lining, or the facing as they call it, is supposed to be cut from the same fabric as the outer layer of the hood because you will see it when the hood is up. Now I didn't have enough fabric to do that, so I was going to line the hood with black crepe, but I did have enough fabric that I could cut the front portion of the hood pieces from coordinating material. So I did that, and then I just seamed on some crepe and cut the piece to the right size. So now when the hood is worn and it's up, you should mostly see this fabric, and the black will be hidden by my head. And I actually forgot to transfer the dart placement onto these pieces, so I need to do that, and then I'll sew up the center back seam, which I've already pinned. I don't have to worry about installing buttonholes into this because this will be the lining, so it'll be slashed and have the edges turned inward to create openings that the buttons can pass through. I don't have to go through the process of creating bound buttonholes in this layer. I went through the whole bound buttonhole sewing process in my last Coatmas video, but I'll explain it super briefly here as well. Basically, you mark the buttonhole placement on the wrong side of the fabric, and then you cut out a square larger than the buttonhole you want to create. You pin that square to the right side of the coat with the wrong side of the buttonhole facing the right side of the coat, and then you sew from the back around the buttonhole marking you made, and then you clip across that line and you fold the facing inward and you press it so it's covering the seam allowance and creating a neat and tidy bound buttonhole. So I'm going to do that for the 3 buttonholes on the coat as well as the ones on the hood, and then I shall report back. I went ahead and sewed the buttonholes, or the bound buttonholes, or the buttonhole facing, depending on how you want to look at it, into the bottom of the hood pieces as well as into the coat. And I just used my presser foot as a guide to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the center point of the buttonhole, and now I'm going to slash that point, clip into the corners, very close to the corners, so when I turn it inward those are nice and sharp, and then I'm going to press the facing over top of the seam allowance to create a nice looking bound buttonhole. And as I said, I did go more in depth about this in my last Coatmas video, so you should watch that if you haven't already. Okay, so here's the outer layer of my hood. I just got the bound buttonholes finished up, so I ironed them, and then I just roughly top stitched around them by hand to secure the layers in place, and then I trimmed excess of the buttonhole facing so it wouldn't extend into the seam allowance, and I sewed up the back seam and I just pressed that open. And I also sewed the darts into that panel, and I sewed the darts into my facing piece, and I also sewed at the back seam of it as well. So now I'm going to pin these together with the right sides facing each other and sew the majority of the front edges together. But as you can see right here, in this diagram, they leave a small portion of the back edge open so you can turn it right side out. So I'm going to do that. So the hood is now done. I got the layers sewn together with the right sides facing each other, and then I turned it right side out and pinned all of the edges together so they were level, and they look nice and crisp from both the interior and the exterior. Then I just turned the bottom portion that I left open inward by 1/2 inch, and I slip stitched the lining, or the facing as they called it, to the exterior fabric layer. I also cut little slashes in the facing fabric and turned the edges inward to create openings for my buttonholes, and now they look nice and sharp, and both of them are done. So the hood is completely finished, and it will mount onto the jacket with buttons and be detachable. And I also finished all of the bound buttonholes on the front of the coat, and I'm pretty pleased with how they look as well. I also have the back piece of the jacket, or the back pieces rather, over here. I just laid these out and removed the flannel lining, and then I pressed that, and then I trimmed it to be the exact size as the outer pieces because it was a little bit wrinkled when I originally cut it out. And now I think I'm going to go ahead and sew up the back seam of both the lining and the outer layer of the jacket. That was instruction number 1. I still don't think I'm really going to follow their instructions, but it doesn't hurt to do this while I have the pieces out. I actually am tempted to work on the sleeves next, just because I feel like these will be the most difficult part after the hood, though the hood wasn't particularly challenging, and the instructions for them looked pretty complicated, so I might take a peek at those and see if I can get these done tonight. So here are our 4 sleeve instructions. Step 5 is join seam of sleeve E matching notches 6. Gather top of sleeve between notches. Join seam of cuff facing F matching notches 7. Press open. Sew the cuff to the sleeve with the seams even, matching notches 8. Turn the cuff to the inside on the seam. Baste the seam, then catch stitch the top edge in position. Turn 7 inches to the outside for cuff in view 1, or turn 2 inches for view 2. Then the next step is just about setting the sleeves. So once again, I think I have to pay careful attention to this because I thought the cuff facing was going to fold outward and form a cuff, but it looks like that is not the case. Instead, you sew the cuff on with the right sides facing each other, and then it flips inward and neatly finishes that edge. I'm also not fully sure what is going on in this diagram here, but I'm sure we can figure it out. So I'm going to start just by sewing together. We're way too zoomed in for you to see what these are. I'm going to start just by sewing up the side seam of sleeve E as they instructed, and these are the main pieces of the sleeves that have just been flat lined with flannel. Then I also have the cuff facing, which is right here, which I think they also want me to seam together. I'll double check that instruction, then do that as well. Then over here I have the sleeve lining piece that I cut out, and they wanted me to cut the sleeve lining at these perforations, but I actually made the sleeves about 1.5 inches longer, so I cut it 1.5 inches beyond that point. So hopefully that all works out. And then I also added a 1/2 inch to both sides, if not a little more, because I added that amount to the side seams of the outer layer of the sleeves as well. So I didn't actually read lining instructions in there. Hopefully they were in there, but I'm going to sew up the side seams first and then figure that out later. I sewed up all of the side seams for the sleeves as well as the back seam for the coat. I still have to press the back seam, but I did go ahead and press all of the sleeve related seams open. And I used my handy dandy sleeve roll to do this. It's not even a sleeve roll, it's a sleeve board. If you don't have one of these, they're amazing for pressing seams. I don't know what I would do without it. And I have triple checked the diagram, and it shows you pinning the cuff so the wrong side is facing outward and the right sides are facing each other. And I have pinned it as such, and I've made sure that the notch is aligned at the bottom edge. So now I'm just going to sew this on and repeat that for the remaining sleeve. So I've skipped back to one of the first instructions, which is regarding the pocket, and I was pretty confused because they keep referring to a facing, but I didn't remember them telling me to cut out a facing. But I reread the cutting instructions, and it turns out they told me to cut 4 facings from the pocket pattern just between the 2 medium perforations, so that's from this point outward, from the outer layer of fabric. So I just did that, and now I'm going to sew these pieces onto the pocket, so that way if any of the pocket flips outward, you'll see the facing which matches the coat as opposed to the contrasting or complementary lining. So I have to face all of those pocket pieces, and then I can get started on some of the body of the jacket assembly, which is exciting. So it is now the next morning, and I have big plans to try and get this coat finished. I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to get it finished before 12:30. Last night I spent about 4 hours editing, which really ate into my coat making time. Last night I was working on the sleeves, and they have this illustration here of what the sleeves are supposed to look like, which I personally found very, very confusing because you'll see that the catch stitching is really close to the bottom edge of the sleeve. But this is actually the illustration for view 1, I think, where you turn 7 inches of the sleeve outward to form a cuff. So then the catch stitching would be really close to the bottom edge of the sleeve. But in reality, that catch stitching is at the top of the facing, which is like 10 inches wide. So even though this doesn't look much like the illustration, I'm pretty sure I've done it properly. And now I'm going to turn the sleeves right side out and just press the bottom edge so it's nice and sharp. I also don't know if I mentioned I was doing it, but I sewed the 2 collar pieces together. They show the steps for the collar right here. It says sew facing to unnotched edge of collar D with right sides of material together. Clip, curve, turn, and press. Baste the neck edges together. I didn't actually end up clipping the edge. Instead, I trimmed it down to about 1/8 of an inch and pressed it open. And then I turned it right side out and pressed it again, so the edge was nice and sharp. And this is really staying and holding in shape quite well. I don't think it's necessary to baste across the bottom edge, but I'm definitely not opposed to doing that if I feel it's necessary assembly in the future. I also did some lining assembly, which I'll show you on my dress form in a sec. Right now the dress form is covered with the coat pieces though, but that'll change in a moment because I'm going to move on to sewing the pockets in place. I faced all 4 of the pocket pieces, and now these are ready to be sewn into the side seams of the coat. Except they don't really want me to do that yet. They want you to sew up the majority of the side seams as well as the shoulder seams. And then once that's done, they want you to insert the pocket pieces in the opening of the side seam. But what I'm going to do instead is sew the pockets onto the front and back panels first, and then sew up the side seam, including the pockets, all at once. If it doesn't end up working, it should be pretty easy to rip out and redo, but I'm feeling somewhat confident that this will work and it will be a much easier way of doing it. I just pinned 1 pocket piece to the front panel and 1 pocket piece to the back panel with the right sides facing each other. Now I'm going to sew the entire edge of the pocket on, but leave the top and bottom 1/2 inch free. That way I don't have to clip in that corner to turn it right side out. Okay, I officially had success with my first pocket, so now I'm repeating that on the other side of the coat. So step 1, it's just sewing it on, as I said. Then you fold that completely flat and you just understitch the seam, so you stitch as close to the edge as you can, folding the seam allowance underneath the pocket piece. And once again, I stopped a 1/2 inch away from each edge of the pocket. Now I'm going to repeat that process on this one, and then we'll come back to show you the next step. So now I'm basically just laying the 2 pieces on top of each other, so the side seam is lined up and the right sides are facing each other. I'm going to sew the side seam normally up until that point where I stop stitching the pocket on. Then I'm going to pivot and sew around the perimeter of the pocket until I reach that other point where I finish sewing them on. Then I'm going to pivot again and sew the rest of the side seam. So the pocket is neatly encased in the side seam, and I don't have to do anything fiddly with trying to insert it after the side seam is sewn. I've done this once before. I can't remember on what. It told me to do it this way in the instructions, and ever since I've been like, why don't all pockets get inserted that way? It is so much easier. Alright, there we go. Now to the sewing machine. So now I'm just going to clip the fabric to the point where my stitching pivoted. If you want, you can also trim excess bulk away at this point. I didn't do that on the other side, but I might as well for this side. And then I'm going to press the seam allowance above and below the pocket open. Once the seam allowance is ironed from the wrong side of the fabric, you want to lay the pocket so it is underneath the front section, and then you're going to lay the seam out all nicely. Then you're just going to press the fabric to sit nicely over the pocket opening. And there you go. That is your pocket. That is a nice little fully functional pocket that's big enough to store some dog poo bags and a phone, which is all you ever really need to have in your pockets. And the next step I'm going to do here is just sewing up the shoulder seams, which they want me to do very early on, but it's so much easier to do this when the coat is flat. So I put off sewing the shoulder seams until the last possible moment. Though sometimes I do sew the shoulder seams first, so then I can install the collar and install the facing before I sew up the side seams. But in this case, I was more concerned about attaching the pocket than I was about attaching the collar. So now these side seams are done up and we can move right along. The next steps for view 2 involve the collar. So they want you to base the collar to the neck, matching notches 5. And once again, they have the diagram that is like 3 steps farther along than the instruction, which makes this sort of confusing, but it's basically just matching the notches and basting the collar on with the right sides facing each other. Easy peasy. Then they want you to turn the under-facing sections, which is this part that extends past the center front edge of the coat and will flip inward. So it's basically a facing portion of the front panel, as opposed to having a separate facing that's seamed on. It says turn under-facing sections to the outside at medium perforations and based with cut edges even, matching notches 5. Stitch the seam. Clip curve of the neck. So basically, you're sewing the collar and the facing in place with the right sides facing each other, and then you clip the curves. You would clip the corners and you would turn it right side out, and then the facing would be flipped to the interior of the coat. Now what I don't like here is that they seem to leave this back edge open, and then I gather you would turn the lining inward and stitch it over top of that edge, but that means that you could potentially see the lining fabric if the collar flipped out too much, and that would be fine if I was using a black lining or coordinating lining, but since I'm going with this bright green lining, I don't really want any of that peeking out. So what I've done is I've drafted a facing for the back, and I did this just by tracing around the top edge of the back panel and adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance so I can actually stitch it on to the front facing that is part of the front panel, and then that will get flipped inward and that will neatly finish that edge, and then I can sew the lining underneath that facing. And once again, I'm going to be sewing the lining underneath the facing instead of sewing it on top of the facing. First step in this process is going to be pinning the collar on, and I think to do that I actually have to clip some of the bound buttonhole facing away because it's extending past the neck edge right now. Yeah, here is where the top line of the fabric is supposed to be, and that's how much the buttonhole facing extends by. So I will just trim that out of the way. I'm so glad these coats have bound buttonholes because my buttonhole foot on my machine isn't working right now. So I either have to buy one for my industrial machine or I have to get a vintage machine that will do them. And I've been looking into vintage machines and there are so many pretty ones. I really want a pink one or like a teal one that matches my sewing room. I've had this teal one bookmarked on eBay for ages. I just haven't pulled the trigger yet because I've had, you know, $2,000 to spend on dog medical bills this month. And that was my Christmas present to myself instead of, you know, a sewing machine. No regrets though. Posey is the best dog and I'd pay whatever I have to get her healthy. Though I'm not even sure this procedure will mean she's healthy. I'm still waiting for the biopsy results, but I really appreciate all of the kind words you guys have given in regards to her recovery. She really is just the sweetest dog ever. And if you haven't seen my other vlogs videos and you don't know what I'm talking about, I ended up adopting a 6-year-old beagle at the end of November. And then at the beginning of December, I took her to the vet and found out that she had cancerous tumors. So she got those removed on the 14th and she got her drain out on the 18th. She's doing really, really well. But unfortunately, she has figured out how to get out of the surgery suit that I altered for her. So now she has to wear a cone when she's not being monitored. And she does not like the cone. She looks very pathetic. And I'm still sleeping on the floor downstairs with her, but I think that's going to come to an end soon enough. So I think she's at a point where jumping off the bed wouldn't be too detrimental. But I'm still going to try and avoid that happening as much as possible. These past couple months have been so crazy. I started filming Coatmas videos middle of November, and I don't think a coat is a particularly difficult thing to make. So I was feeling pretty good about when I started. I figured that gave me a week for each coat. I could edit the videos as I made the coat, and then December could really just be focused on getting my Christmas costume done and getting that video edited. And I finished the first coat on like December 3rd, and then I finished the second coat the day before the video about it went up. And it's gonna be the same situation with this one. So I've ended up making like 3 coats in a week and a half instead of the 4 weeks I'd originally planned, but it is what it is. Sometimes plans have to change. So that is the collar, and now basically this facing from the front panel is going to flip outward, and I'm going to match the notches up and pin this along the edge as well. But before doing that, I have to sew the facing on. So we're just going to pin this on, and then I'm going to sew this on, and then I'm going to carry on pinning the facing around the neck edge. Okay, I realize now this just looks like a sea of green, but I've officially sewn the facing on, or the back neck facing on. So now I'm just going to match up those notches and match up the shoulder seams and get this baby pinned on. The other thing I forgot to mention about my dog is, you know, when you rescue a dog, it takes a while for them to get used to your routine, for you to adjust to their routine, kind of combine those two things together and make them comfortable. That was, you know, already a step back, but it was one I was completely willing to make, though it wasn't one I expected to make because I didn't think I was going to get another dog so soon. Anyway, so we got her home and she wasn't spayed, which was fine. I was perfectly fine getting her spayed, and she went into heat. Like, dogs go into heat once or twice a year, and she went into heat the week I brought her home. And I've never dealt with a dog in heat before, so that was an adventure too. And that's probably way too much info about my dog, period, much less for a single clip and a single video. So now I'm going to go ahead and get this sewn. Alright, so it still looks like a massive houndstooth, but now the collar is sewn on. I clipped the corners, I clipped the seam-lands, I turned it right side out, or turned the facing inward rather. Can we just talk about how close they fit that buttonhole to the edge of the fabric and how freaking evil that is? Like, how am I supposed to slash and line this without it looking terrible? I'm gonna have to use really big buttons so they cover up the buttonholes. Not that I've ever used that tactic before or anything. That would be unprofessional. I'm going to go ahead and turn the bottom edge of the facing pieces inward by a 1/2 inch and then just machine stitch that down. So that's going to be all across this edge and also across the back facing piece that I drafted. And that way I can tuck the flannel lining underneath it. And for this piece, they actually had separate lines you cut the lining out on. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it said to cut the lining to where the medium perforations are. So the lining is actually cut so it will sit just underneath included facing. So that's nice. So I guess I will have to cut down the back of the lining slightly since I ended up adding my own facing. But that should be an easy change. Also, look at my nails. It just looks like their normal beige color with some sparkles, but it's actually a thermal polish. So it changes from this nudie transparent color to red when it gets cold. So the tips of your nails that extend past your nail bed look like a different color than the rest of the nail. So it's like a constant colorful French manicure just because of how the polish reacts to heat. I guess my pinky finger is cold right now. But it's so funny because you'll like be washing dishes or something and your nails will all be nude and then you'll go outside and they'll be bright red. I miss the polish, by the way. It is called Fancy Christmas by Fancy Gloss. And I've been really into Fancy Gloss polishes recently. I really need to do an updated nail polish video because I've bought so many since then. But Fancy Gloss has been my most worn brand recently. So the next instruction was turn the fronts to inside and press on lines of medium perforations to form underfacings, based in position. Finish the buttonholes. So I actually didn't transfer those medium perforations onto the fabric, so I just sort of turned them inward by eye to a point where they were evenly spaced away from the edges of the buttonholes. And then I measured how much of the facing was turned inward and copied that on the other side. So that's not exactly how they want it done, but it got done, so that's fine. And I actually still have to press it, and I don't know that I'll end up basting it. I might just pin it for now. But I am going ahead and finishing the bound buttonholes. Basically, I've just slashed the interior and folded the edges inward, so now I can neatly finish them. And oh my god, this fabric is like perfect if you suck at buttonholes. It hides a world of hurt because it's like, fluffy is the wrong word, but it's a slightly looser but also thick weave. And with the vibrant color and the print, it just hides flaws really nicely. So that's good for me since I sort of suck at buttonholes of all forms. Hand-sewn ones, bound ones, machine-sewn ones. Buttonholes are just not my forte. But I'm going to keep doing them because that's the only way you learn. And I say I'm going to keep doing them, but I do also avoid them if there's any other closure option that I think would be superior. So this is the last one that I had to line, and then the next steps are in regards to the sleeves. And I've actually already assembled the sleeves, so now it's just time to set them, which I'm not looking forward to at all. So though I followed their instructions for attaching the cuff, the first step for making the sleeves is actually joining the side seam and then gathering the top edge between the notches. And you gather this edge so you can ease it into the arm side. And once it's finished, you shouldn't see any gathers in this edge. So I have to do that, and then I'm just skipping over the cuff instructions since we already did that. And the next relevant step is pin and baste the sleeve in armhole with medium perforations at the shoulder seam, matching notches 9 and back and notches 10 in front. Ease sleeve over the shoulder, shrink out ease, then stitch the seam. But step 1 is just going to be sewing a row of gathering and leaving the edges loose so I can pull them to better set the sleeve into the arm side later on. Alright, so I've gathered down the tops of the sleeves, and I was originally going to leave the thread free and then I could pull it and gather it more or less, depending on how much it needed to be gathered to fit into the arm openings. But then I remembered when I sewed these sleeves onto the lining, there's about 2 inches that I had to ease, and for the lining I just did that by pleating the fabric. So I ended up pulling my thread so the tops were taken in by 2 inches. Now I'm just going to evenly distribute the gathers on the top edge of the sleeve, and then I'm going to take it over to my ironing board and completely wet the top of the sleeve and steam all of that volume out. Basically when it's wet, it's malleable, and when you steam it or it gets hot, it shrinks. Or not even shrinks, it just sort of sets the fibers into whatever position it's currently in. So that's how you can use wool to wet mold hats and create cloche hats and stuff without having any seams in them. It also works for making alterations to wool to get a better fit over the body. So you'll see it done a lot in tailoring to a minor degree as well. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to steam this over top of a ham. I know this is going up around Christmas, so there might be some confusion, but when I say ham, I mean like a tailor's ham like this. You can just get them off of Amazon, so that's a little bit easier to press against than a flat surface. Also, this is my spray bottle of water that I will be using to get it wet, and as you can see, I melted a hole in it at one point. Oops. So the sleeves were shrunk and then I pinned them in place, and I didn't even end up basting them in place because they fit so nicely, and look at how beautifully they turned out. You've got a bit of volume over top of the seam, which is as expected since you gathered and shrunk it to fit, or rather I gathered and shrunk it to fit, but there's no visible puckering or gathers, which is exactly what you want. So I'm super pleased with that. I still have to put it on my dress form and then press the seam allowance flat, but I was so happy that I did go ahead and sew another line of stitching a 1/4 inch away from the first. Now I'm going to trim very close to that second line of stitching to finish the seam off. The next step I think is just going to be inserting the lining and figuring out the hem. So we're almost done. I don't think I'm quite going to get this finished by 12:30. I spent so much time editing last night that it just wasn't likely to get finished early on today, but it will get finished today. That I am sure of. I just went ahead and put the jacket on my dress form and trimmed the hem a little bit. They do say in the instructions to hang it overnight and then trim it, which I would do if I had more time, but I think since this is such a heavy wool, it's unlikely to fall much and to warp out of shape and to really need to be trimmed after hanging. So after trimming it a little bit, I just marked a line 3 inches away from the bottom edge of the coat, and I turned the bottom edge up to meet that line. Now, since the coat flares outward, the bottom edge is a little bit larger than the portion I was trying to pin it to. So what they tell you to do is to gather across the bottom edge of the coat and then turn it up to meet the line you've marked, and then to ease it using steam. So once again, much like we did with the sleeves, you would wet the fabric and then steam it so it better takes on the shape of the hem without being puckered or anything. So I didn't end up using basting stitches to achieve that effect. Instead, I just pinned it and then wet the fabric and steamed it, and it seems to have turned out pretty well. And then once I finish sewing it down, I'll steam it again. And I'm sewing this down using a catch stitch, as they tell you to in the instructions, but it also happens to be my favorite stitch for sewing a hem. And usually I don't like sewing the hem directly on the wool fabric. I haven't done that for any of the other coats in this series, because you can sometimes see indentations from these stitches from the exterior. But since this is a slightly softer weave, I think it's going to look just fine. And then I will slip stitch the lining to cover the hem. Speaking of the lining, off camera I did assemble that, so I just sewed up the side seams and the shoulder seams of the flannel, and then I sewed on the sleeves that I cut out of the silky lining. And instead of doing the whole pressing out the bulk sort of thing that I did for the wool sleeves, I just pleated the top slightly to fit them to the arm side. So the lining is ready to be inserted. Actually, that's not true. I'm going to hem the lining by a 1/2 inch and then insert it. And I'm probably going to ignore their lining instructions once again and just pin it in place the way I did last time by putting the coat on my dress form inside out and then putting the lining over top of it and pinning it so everything lines up nicely. So that'll be the next step once I finish this hem. And now my hem is done, so I can go over to the ironing board and give that a press and then get to pinning the lining in place. Okay, I just got out the camera to film and realized I forgot to pin the back hem of the lining, but the rest is pinned in place. So much like with the last coat, I lined up the seams, and then I let the lining just fall naturally, and then I pinned it to sit underneath the facing. So it's all underneath the front facing, and then the lining for the sleeves laps over the sleeve facing. So that'll get whip stitched on, or slip stitched on rather. All of it will get slip stitched in place. And then I hemmed the lining independently. I was having some sewing machine issues, so it's sort of poorly sewn, but it is what it is. And then I pinned it so the raw edges were even and it was lapping slightly over the hem allowance so it covers up the raw edge. Once again, you can see the lining is bagging in over itself, so it's not putting any tension on the exterior of the coat, which means it won't change the shape of the coat at all. So I just have to continue that for the back panel, but then the lining will all be pinned in place and then I can get it sewn on. And then the final step is going to be rolling the cuffs outward, pressing the sleeves, pressing the collar, and sewing on buttons. And then it will be done. Unfortunately, it is 12:53, so I've missed my 24-hour deadline, but I should be able to do it in 26 hours, which is almost the same thing. So here's the coat on its dress form in all its glory. I completely slip stitched in the lining and then I went ahead and added buttons. I had a few different button options, most of which will look familiar if you saw my previous Coatmas video. Basically came down to these domed plastic ones or these very cartoonish looking flat ones. And I ended up going for the domed shank back buttons just because I thought they would be a little bit easier to do up and undo. They're also a little bit smaller, which I thought would look better around the collar, attaching the hood because it is a relatively small area. But as you can see, all the buttons got sewn on. Figured out the placement just by lapping the edges over top of each other and then marking where the buttonholes were. For marking the collar, or where to put them beneath the collar to mount the hood, it was a little bit more challenging. I ended up measuring straight away for the center front, or not even center front, but the front edges, and figuring out how to position them that way. And I think it worked out pretty well. It looks pretty symmetrical and I'm pretty happy with the look in general. They said the lining was all slip stitched in place, and then after I finished lining the sleeves, I could just turn the cuff outward by about 2 inches like they wanted me to. So now I just had to lint roll this guy and then I can take it out for a spin and get some photos of it worn to share with all of you. And I can also cut to an outro, which is probably what you'll be seeing in the next clip. Actually, no, before I go, I do just want to mention that I found the perfect hat to go with this on Etsy. It's got a black veil and black velvet details and black feathers, but it's like the perfect minty-ish greenish color to go with this. And someone might have spent 2 hours last night dyeing their hair a slightly bluer shade of green in order to better coordinate with this coat. But I'm not going to name any names there. So that is it for this video. I think I put the finishing touches on the coat at around 2:30 or 3 o'clock. Took me about an hour to sew the lining in, and then I took a little break and then I got all of the buttons sewn on. I didn't quite hit my 24-hour deadline, but I did get pretty close and I'm pretty happy with the coat I ended up with. I think the color of it and the fabric is just so luscious and wonderful and I can't wait to wear it. Though I probably won't be wearing it with a coordinating hat and reproduction shoes. I'm probably gonna wear it with like black Uggs while walking my dog. But I did enjoy getting all dolled up to take the photos of this, and I think it's really striking. I do have a couple faults with this coat though. For one thing, it is so swingy. As I said in my last video, I do really like swing coats. I love how comfy they are and how they fit over pretty much anything. I enjoy wearing them and find them to be a surprisingly practical garment while still having a pretty iconic 1950s silhouette. Something easy to work into my everyday wardrobe, which is always fun. But this one is so wide, it's almost comical and hard hard to find the pockets because they sit so far back on the body because the front pieces are so wide. So I wish it was a little bit more tailored to the body while keeping that swingy style to it. My other issue is with the hood, and I love the hood. I love the size of it and the shape of it, and it's relatively easy to get on and off, but is kind of annoying that you have to have the coat fully buttoned up before you can put on the hood. It's not really an issue when you're getting ready at home, but if you were getting into a car and out of a car and taking the coat on and off, or going to a restaurant and then taking the coat on and off, I think it would become really annoying to have the hood on and have to remove the hood and remove the coat and then re-button on the hood so it doesn't get lost while you're hanging your coat up, and then the whole process repeats itself when you want to go and get back on. I wish they designed this in such a way that you could keep the hood attached to the coat even when you're not wearing it, or when you don't have it fully buttoned up. So those are my only two real qualms with this coat. Otherwise, I think it's just a delight, and I really did enjoy the process of making it. Even though it was a little bit rushed, I don't think the quality of the construction suffered too much for it. So I enjoyed this, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video about making it. Like with all of the other coats I've made in Coatmas, I did originally have a 1940s dress plan to go underneath this. It's actually going to be made following another advanced pattern, and I'm going to be using this really cool polka dot silky fabric. It actually has black, white, and green polka dots on it, so I think it will coordinate really, really well with this fabric and create a really stylish look. So if you're interested in that, then I would love for you to subscribe and keep an eye out for it. And before I go, I do just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who actually picked this pattern for me to follow. These are the October credits, and I'll have the names of all my $10 and up patrons featured on screen. But I want to give a special shout out to my top tier patrons who are Mary Kinsey, Cass, Tracy Smith, Courtney F., Mo Quintana, Sharon Cyrus, Emma Hargrave, and Jordan Carpenter. As always, your support really means the world to me, and thank you so much for allowing me to make videos and to keep creating content. It really does mean a lot, especially since I haven't been the best with producing content this year. I think it's been a rough year for all of us, and I've been very lucky in a lot of ways, but my creativity has definitely suffered because of it. So I appreciate all of your support and all of you guys for watching too. If you enjoyed this video, giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. And I'll talk to all of you very soon because I do have one more video I want to get out before Christmas. Wish me luck with that. Oh, and one more thing before I go, I just wanted to mention that I got the biopsy results back for my dog, and I'm so happy to say that she is cancer-free. It really was just the best possible news I could have gotten, and I'm so, so happy that I will hopefully have many wonderful years with her. So thank you for all of your kind comments throughout this process over on Instagram and in the comment section here on YouTube as well. It meant a lot, and I just wanted to share that good news with you as well. So on that note, I'm finally going. Thank you again for watching, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.